Elias Turner saw them first as ghosts, two small shapes shimmering in the heat haze at the edge of his land. They weren't moving fast, more like drifting, shadows clinging to the dusty road that led to his quiet ranch and then nowhere else. He was drawing water, the groan of the well rope the only sound for miles. But he stopped, his hands, calloused and sure, went still. He hadn't seen a soul on that road in 6 months. And he hadn't heard a child's voice on this land in 2 long, silent years. The shapes got closer. A girl, maybe 6 years old, pulling a boy who looked even smaller. Her dress was the color of a faded sky after a storm. His head hung so low his chin was bumping his chest with every ragged step. They walked like they'd already gone 100 miles and had 100 more to go. When they reached his gate, a flimsy thing of wire and wood, the girl stopped. She straightened her tiny shoulders like a soldier bracing for a final charge. "Sir," she called out. Her voice was thin, but it cut through the morning quiet like a knife. "We ate stale bread 2 days ago. My brother's real tired." Elias just stood there, the bucket swaying over the dark mouth of the well. His first thought, the one that came from the cold, quiet part of him, was to send them on their way. Town was 10 miles east. There were folks there, a church, an orphan train that sometimes passed through. This wasn't his trouble. This wasn't his fight. But then he saw the boy's feet. Bare, caked in dirt and raw at the edges. Something inside Elias, a bolt that had rusted shut years ago, gave a painful lurch. He let the well rope go. The bucket clattered against the stone. "Come in," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "No one stays hungry at my place." The girl's expression didn't change. She just watched him, her eyes old and measuring. Then, with a single sharp nod, she unlatched the gate and led her brother through. They moved like frightened fawns, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. Elias met them in the middle of the yard. The boy was clinging to her skirt, his breathing shallow and fast. Elias crouched down to their level. The smell of dust and exhaustion rose from them. "You walked far," he said. "It wasn't a question." "All night," the girl confirmed, her chin held high. "He fell once, but I picked him up." The boy's lip began to tremble. A single tear cut a clean path through the grime on his cheek. Elias swallowed, the knot in his throat feeling like a stone. He stood up and pointed toward the simple wooden cabin. "Let's get you inside." The house was cool and dark. It smelled of wood smoke and solitude. The girl's eyes darted everywhere, taking in the single room, the rifle propped by the door, the worn Bible on a small shelf. Elias didn't say a word. He just set a bucket of fresh water down and fetched what he had. Cold beans, the last of a cornbread loaf, and milk from that morning. He put it all on the rough wooden table. "Eat," he said. The boy practically lunged at the food, scooping beans with his bare hands. Elias slid a spoon toward him without comment. The girl was more cautious. She watched her brother for a long moment before taking a small, careful bite of bread, chewing it slowly as if trying to make it last. She was rationing it, even now with a plate full of food in front of her. Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, the silence of his home now filled with the small sounds of children eating. It was a strange music. "You got folks somewhere?" he asked after a while. The girl didn't look up from her plate. "Not anymore," she said, her voice flat. "Mama's gone." She poked at her beans. She stopped, her throat seeming to close up. Elias didn't push. He knew what grief looked like. He poured them both a tin cup of milk. "Drink slow," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Plenty more." When they were finished, the boy's head drooped, and he fell asleep right there at the table. The girl gently smoothed his hair, her own eyes glassy with fatigue. "There's a bed in the back," Elias said. "You can lay him down." She looked at him then, a full, searching gaze. She seemed to be looking for a hidden angle, a trick. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found it, or not found it, because she nodded. She gathered the boy into her arms, stumbling a little under his weight, and carried him to the small back room. Elias watched her lay him on the cot and pull an old quilt over him. When she came back, she stood by the door, poised for flight. "We don't mean no trouble, sir," she said. Elias's jaw tightened. "You won't bring trouble by staying," he replied. Rest. We'll figure things out when the sun's high. She nodded but didn't relax. She went to the window and stared out at the road, watching. Always watching. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his hand instinctively brushing the smooth stock of the rifle. The sun was burning off the morning mist, and out on the horizon he could see them clearly. Wagon tracks, fresh ones, cutting deep into the dirt road. They were heading this way, and they were made by a heavy load, moving fast. The kind of tracks someone leaves when they're not just traveling, they're hunting. The quiet of the ranch felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the held breath before a storm. The cabin had a new smell that morning. Wood smoke and old ashes, yes, but now mixed with the faint scent of milk and the warm, sleeping breath of children. Elias had banked the fire and sat in the dark for hours, listening. The girl had eventually curled up on the cot next to her brother, her small hand draped over his chest, a silent guardian. When the first light hit the window, it caught the gold in her hair, and for a second she just looked like a little girl, not a tiny soldier. He had coffee brewing and a skillet of eggs on the stove when they woke. The boy came out first, rubbing his eyes, looking like a startled prairie dog. The girl followed, her movement still wary, but the exhaustion was gone from her eyes. It was replaced by something else, a sharp, focused alertness. "You cook every morning?" she asked as she climbed onto the bench at the table. "Most mornings," Elias said, sliding a plate in front of her. "Some days it's just coffee, but coffee don't fill a belly." The boy managed a small grin and grabbed for the cornbread. Elias pushed the butter dish toward him. "Slow down," he said gently. "There's plenty more." He noticed it again. The girl waited. She watched her brother eat half his plate before she even picked up her own fork. She was taking care of him with a fierceness that was unsettling in someone so small. After he was done, the boy found a little wooden horse by the hearth, one Elias hadn't seen in years, and started running it through the dust motes in a sunbeam. The girl, however, stayed at the table, her back ramrod straight. "Where'd you two come from?" Elias finally asked. She glanced toward the window before answering. "South Road," she said. "We just kept walking." "That so?" "Yes, sir." Her answers were short, clipped. Not rude, but guarded. He'd heard that tone before, words chosen like stones to cross a rushing river. One wrong step and you're swept away. He decided not to press. He just nodded toward the Bible on the shelf. "You know how to read?" "A little," she said. "Mama taught us some." "Maybe you can read some to us after supper tonight," he offered. She didn't say yes, but her small hands, which had been clenched in her lap, relaxed just a little. He took that as a win. The day passed in a slow, steady rhythm. Elias went out to mend a section of the corral fence. The children shadowed him, staying within the relative safety of the yard. The boy made soft hoofbeat sounds with his wooden horse in the dirt. The girl stood by the porch, her hands gripping the rail, her eyes fixed on the long, empty road. "You keep watching that road," Elias commented as he walked past, a heavy post balanced on his shoulder. She shrugged one bony shoulder. "Sometimes he comes after us." Elias stopped dead. The post felt suddenly heavier. "Who?" The girl's gaze dropped to the ground. "The man Mama married," she whispered. "He says we're his property. But he don't feed us, he just drinks." A cold anger settled in Elias's gut. "You ever go to the law, the preacher?" Her face went hard, a look far too old for her years. "Preacher told us to obey. The law said it was a family matter, said he wasn't breaking no laws." Elias wanted to curse. Instead, he walked to the next fence post, swung the hammer, and drove a nail home with a single ringing blow. The sound echoed across the yard, carrying the fury he couldn't speak. By noon, the fence was stronger than it had been in years. As the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a strange kind of peace settled over the small ranch. The three of them sat on the porch steps. The boy, tired from a day of play, leaned against Elias's knee, half asleep. The girl was humming a quiet, wordless tune. It was the first time he'd seen her look even remotely relaxed. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder. A single rider, moving at a deliberate pace. A cloud of dust followed him like a ghost. Elias felt his body go rigid. He rose slowly to his feet. The girl went pale, but to his surprise, she didn't run. She stood beside him, a tiny defiant statue. The rider slowed as he approached the gate. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, his face hidden by the brim of a dark hat. He raised a hand in a lazy, almost mocking greeting. He looked at the house, at Elias, at the two children standing on the porch. His gaze lingered for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, without a word, he spurred his horse and continued down the road. Elias watched until the rider was just a speck, until the dust he'd kicked up had settled back onto the earth. The air, which had felt peaceful moments before, now felt tight and heavy. He sat back down, the wood of the steps cool against his legs. The girl's small hand brushed his sleeve. "He saw us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," Elias said, his eyes still scanning the darkening horizon. "But that wasn't him," she added, her voice barely audible. "That wasn't the man Mama married." Elias turned to look at her. Her face was a mask of confusion and a fear deeper than any he had seen before. If that wasn't the man they were running from, then who was he? And what did he want? The prairie suddenly felt a lot smaller. The isolation he'd cultivated for 2 years was no longer a comfort. It was a trap, and they were all in it. The next morning broke with a strange tension in the air. The gold light of dawn seemed to do little to warm the cabin. Elias was already outside, tightening a wire on the fence, his movements methodical, deliberate. He was working to keep his mind from racing. The girl's words from the night before echoed in his head. That wasn't him. So who was he? A scout, someone sent to look for them. The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. He heard the boy laugh from inside the cabin, a bright, carefree sound that felt completely out of place. It startled him. He hadn't realized how used to the silence he'd become. When the children came outside, the girl had already brushed her brother's hair and tucked in his shirt. She had found a small watering can and was carefully tending to a scraggly patch of beans by the porch. "You take to work quick," Elias said, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. She looked up, that serious line etched between her brows. "If we don't work, we get in trouble." "Not here," Elias told her, his voice firm. "Here, work is just work. No one's keeping score." She seemed to ponder this, as if the idea of labor without the threat of punishment was a foreign concept. After a simple breakfast, he took the boy to the barn to show him how to scatter feed for the half-dozen chickens he kept. The boy's small hands clutched the scoop like it was a sacred object. His face was a mask of concentration until one of the hens flapped its wings too close, and he let out a squeal of delighted terror. Elias felt a chuckle rise in his chest, a rusty, unfamiliar sound. He found the girl by the corral fence a little later, just standing there, staring at the thick center post. "What is it?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the wood. "He used to do it to the post," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear. "The horsewhip. He'd whip the post, right outside our window, just to scare us. Said next time it would be us." Her brother, she added, still had nightmares about the sound. Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked out across the empty prairie, the vast blue sky seeming to mock the ugliness of her words. He crouched down to her level. "You don't have to fear a whip here," he said, his voice slow and even. "No one will ever raise a hand to you on this land. I promise you that." For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear or suspicion crossed her face. It was hope, so fragile and delicate it almost hurt to look at. The day grew hotter. Elias fixed a broken latch on the barn door, hauled water for the horses, his mind constantly turning over the problem of the mysterious rider. The children stayed close, their world seemingly shrunk to the safe perimeter of the cabin and the barn. When a hawk cried out overhead, the boy flinched so violently he dropped his wooden horse. Elias picked it up, brushed the dust off its flank, and handed it back. "You keep that safe," he said. "The world feels steadier when you have something to hold on to." The boy nodded, his expression grave, and clutched the toy to his chest. As the sun began its slow descent, another rider appeared on the road. This one was different. He rode a smaller horse and wasn't as imposing as the man from the day before, but he did the same thing. He slowed, almost to a stop, near the gate. He shaded his eyes and stared at the house for a long, deliberate minute. Elias, who had been splitting wood, stood up straight, the axe held loosely in his hand. The set of his shoulders, the quiet stillness of his body was a clear warning. Don't come any closer. The rider seemed to understand. After a moment, he nudged his horse and continued on his way, the dust rising behind him. That night at supper, the mood was somber. The girl barely touched her food. "What if he comes back?" she asked, her voice a small whisper in the quiet cabin. She didn't say which he she meant. It didn't matter. "Then I'll be here," Elias said simply. She studied his face, weighing his words, searching for their truth. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. After the boy was asleep, the girl lingered by the door. "Mama used to sing to us," she said suddenly, real soft so he wouldn't hear. She said that as long as we could still sing, we were still our own. We weren't his. Elias felt that old, rusted lock inside his chest give another painful turn. He just nodded. "Your mama was a smart woman." She nodded back, then disappeared into the back room. He sat by the dying fire for a long time that night, the rifle propped against the table beside him. He had come to this ranch to be left alone, to let the world forget he existed. But the world had a long memory, and it had found him. The tracks on the road, the silent, watching riders, the haunted look in a little girl's eyes. They were all messages. His days of hiding were over. Before the sun was even a suggestion in the east, Elias was up, saddling his horse. He needed answers. "You leaving?" A small, sharp voice cut through the pre-dawn gloom. The girl was standing on the porch, a silhouette against the dark cabin. "Just to town," Elias said, cinching the saddle tight. "Need some flour, and I need to ask a few questions." She chewed on her lip, her expression a mixture of fear and reluctant trust. Then she gave a curt nod. He rode hard, the miles falling away under his horse's steady hooves. The town was little more than a dusty main street with a handful of buildings: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office. Elias tied his horse in front of the store, but his destination was the squat building with the faded star painted on the window. The sheriff was a man named Miller, fleshy and soft, with eyes that were too small for his face. He was leaning back in his chair, boots up on his desk, when Elias walked in. "Turner," he said, not bothering to sit up. "Didn't expect to see you. Thought you'd decided to become a hermit." "I need to ask you something," Elias said, ignoring the jibe. "You heard anything about two kids on their own? A girl and a boy, maybe 6 and 4. Sheriff Miller swung his boots off the desk and leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. A strange look, a kind of guarded interest came into his eyes. "Can't say that I have. Why? You see some strays?" "Something like that," Elias said, watching the sheriff carefully. "They came to my place yesterday. Said they were running from their stepfather." Miller chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Well, that ain't exactly against the law, now is it? A man's got a right to his own family." He picked up a piece of paper from his desk, dismissing Elias. "My advice? Send 'em on their way. Not your business, Turner. Best you remember that." The casual cruelty, the deliberate disinterest, set Elias's teeth on edge. It wasn't right. He left the office with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He bought the flour and some other supplies, his mind racing. The sheriff's reaction wasn't just indifference, it was a warning: stay out of it. The ride back to the ranch was tense. The wind had picked up, whipping dust into the air, obscuring the horizon. As he got closer, he saw the girl running toward him, her small legs pumping, her face pale with terror. "A wagon," she gasped, breathless. "It came by while you were gone. It didn't stop, but the man—" He stood up and looked right at the house. Elias's blood ran cold. He swung down from his horse, resting a hand on her shoulder to steady her and himself. "It's all right," he said, his voice calmer than he felt. "We'll be ready next time." But as he looked past her, toward the empty road, he knew this was an escalation. First, a rider who just looked. Then another. Now a man in a wagon, making sure they saw him. They weren't just being watched anymore, they were being cornered. And he had a sinking feeling that the man the children were truly afraid of, The real threat was still to come, and Sheriff Miller, the law itself, would do absolutely nothing to stop him. In fact, Elias suspected he might even be helping him. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke that night. Rain lashed against the small cabin, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Inside, the three of them were a small island of warmth and light in the vast, dark prairie. The boy was asleep on the cot, but the girl sat by the fire, sharpening a stick with a small knife Elias had given her, her movements precise and focused. "He's coming soon, isn't he?" she said, not looking up. "Yes," Elias said. There was no point in lying to her. "I think he is." "Are you scared?" Elias considered the question. He looked at his hands, the hands of a farmer, a rancher. But they remembered the feel of a pistol grip, the weight of a rifle stock in a tense standoff. "I'm not scared of him," he said truthfully. "I'm scared of what happens if I'm not ready." The next day dawned grey and damp, the land washed clean by the storm. Elias worked with a grim purpose. He checked the action on his rifle, cleaned and oiled it until it moved with silent, deadly efficiency. He boarded up the small back window of the cabin, leaving only a narrow slit to see through. He brought extra water in from the well. He was fortifying his home, turning his sanctuary into a fortress. The children watched him, their play forgotten. The boy stayed close to his sister, his wooden horse clutched tight in his hand. The girl followed Elias, a silent apprentice, handing him nails, holding the lantern steady. She understood what he was doing. She was a child who had learned the hard lessons of survival far too early. Around noon the sound came, not the single hoofbeats of a rider, but the heavy rhythmic rumble of a wagon, its wheels churning through the wet dirt. Elias sent the children inside. "Stay in the back room," he ordered. "Don't come out, no matter what you hear." The girl nodded, her face grim, and pulled her brother into the small dark room, closing the door behind them. Elias took the rifle from its place by the door and stepped out onto the porch. He stood there, legs planted, the rifle held loosely at his side, and waited. The wagon crested the small rise in the road. It was a sturdy farm wagon, pulled by a single powerful horse. The man holding the reins was big, dressed in rough work clothes, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He pulled the wagon to a stop right in front of the gate, but he didn't get down. He just sat there, staring at Elias. This had to be him, the stepfather. "You got something that belongs to me," the man called out, his voice a low growl that carried easily in the still air. Elias didn't move a muscle. "They're just children," he called back, his own voice calm and steady. "They don't belong to anyone." The man's mouth twisted into a sneer. "They're mine, by law. Their mother married me. That makes them my responsibility. And I've come to take them home." "They walked here half-starved," Elias said, his grip tightening on the rifle. "This looks more like a home than whatever they ran from." "You're meddling in family business, old man," the man snarled, his hands clenching on the reins. "The law in this town, Sheriff Miller, he knows me. He knows they're mine. You think you can stand against the law?" "I'm not standing against the law," Elias said, his voice dropping, becoming as cold and hard as iron. "I'm standing against you. A man who lets children go hungry forfeits his rights. You want them? You'll have to come through me." For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the drip of water from the eaves of the porch and the soft stamp of the horse's hoof. The man in the wagon stared at Elias, his eyes full of a dark, simmering rage. He looked at the rifle, then back at Elias's face, at the unyielding set of his jaw. Something in Elias's quiet certainty, his absolute refusal to be moved, seemed to give the man pause. Finally, with a curse, the man spat in the dirt. "This ain't over," he growled. "You can't keep them forever." "Long as they need keeping, I can," Elias replied, his voice an unwavering promise. The man jerked the reins, turning the wagon in a tight, angry circle. The wheels threw mud as he drove away, not looking back. Elias stayed on the porch, rifle in hand, until the wagon was completely out of sight. He opened the cabin door. The girl was standing right there, her little fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Her brother was peeking out from behind her legs. Tears were streaming down her face, but she stood tall and straight. He didn't take us," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. "No," Elias said, his voice gentle. "He didn't." The boy ran to him then, wrapping his arms around Elias's legs and burying his face in his trousers. Elias rested a heavy hand on the boy's head. The girl came forward slowly, and for the first time, she initiated contact. She reached out and took his other hand, her small fingers curling around his. The trust in that simple gesture was a heavier weight than the rifle had been. That night something shifted. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was joined by something new. A fragile, tentative sense of hope. Elias found himself telling them stories, old tales his own father had told him. He even tried to sing a song, his voice rusty and off-key, which sent the boy into a fit of giggles. For the first time in 2 years, the cabin was filled with the sound of laughter. But later, as he sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle again, he knew the man was right. This wasn't over. A man like that, full of pride and anger, doesn't just give up. He would be back. And when he came back, he wouldn't be alone. He would bring the law with him. And Elias knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Sheriff Miller's version of the law would not be on the side of two helpless children. It would be on the side of the man who claimed them as property. He had won the first battle. But the war was just beginning, and the odds were stacked against them. The next few days passed in a strange, tense quiet. It was the calm before the inevitable storm. Elias taught the boy how to whittle a piece of wood into a rough-looking bird. He showed the girl how to track a rabbit by its prints in the soft earth. They were small lessons, distractions from the waiting. But the waiting was always there, in the back of their minds, in the way the girl would stop and listen every time the wind rustled the grass, in the way the boy would jump at any sudden noise. Elias knew he had to do something. He couldn't just sit here and wait for the stepfather and Sheriff Miller to show up with a piece of paper that would rip this fragile new family apart. He had to give them a reason not to come back, a reason that was stronger than threats and rifles. He found it in the girl's pocket. He'd seen her with it before, a small lumpish object she was always touching, always checking on. One afternoon, as she was helping him mend a saddle strap, it fell out and rolled under the porch steps. It was a locket, tarnished brass, shaped like a heart, with no chain. "What's this?" he asked, picking it up. Her eyes went wide with panic. She snatched it from his hand. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "It was Mama's." "Can I see it?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her small face a storm of indecision. Then, slowly, she handed it back to him. Elias pressed the small clasp. It didn't open. It was stuck, or maybe locked. He turned it over in his palm. It was heavier than it looked, and on the back, almost completely worn away, was a small engraved symbol, a single stylized M. Elias froze, his blood turned to ice in his veins. He had seen that symbol before, a long time ago, in a different life. It was the mark of the McKinley Gang, a ruthless band of outlaws he had hunted back when he was a Texas Ranger. A gang led by a man named Jedediah McKinley, a man who was supposedly dead, a man who had a younger brother who had gone on to become the respectable, law-abiding sheriff of a small dusty town. Sheriff Miller. Everything clicked into place. The sheriff's hostility. His warning to stay out of it. The strange riders who were watching the ranch. This wasn't about a stepfather claiming his property. This was about something much, much bigger. And these children, this girl with her mother's locket, were right in the middle of it. "This locket," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Why is it so important?" The girl looked at the ground. "Mama said, she said it was our key, our way out. She said if anything ever happened to her, we were to take this and run, and never ever let him get it." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "He's not our stepfather. He was just a man who came to see Mama. He wanted this. When she wouldn't give it to him, he got angry. She told us to run. So we ran." The story she had told him about the mean stepfather had been a lie, a story her mother had coached her to tell, to protect them, to hide the real truth. "Who is he?" Elias asked, his heart pounding. "I don't know his name," she whispered, "but he wore a star, just like the man in town." Sheriff Miller. This changed everything. The children weren't just runaways, they were witnesses. And the locket wasn't just a keepsake. It was evidence. Evidence of what, Elias didn't know. But he knew, with a sudden terrifying clarity, that Miller wouldn't stop until he had it back. And he would not leave any witnesses alive to tell the tale. The ranch was no longer a fortress. It was a death trap. "Pack your things," Elias said, his voice tight. "What little you have. We're leaving. Now." "Where are we going?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. Elias looked out at the vast, empty prairie. There was nowhere to run where a man like Miller couldn't find them, nowhere to hide, except for one place, a place from his past, a place of shadows and secrets. "We're not going to run," Elias said, a grim determination settling over him. "We're going to fight, but not here. We're going to take the fight to him." He looked down at the locket in his hand, the small brass heart that held the key to everything. "First," he said, "we need to find out what's inside this thing." They left the ranch under the cover of darkness. Elias didn't even bother to lock the cabin door. There was nothing in there worth stealing, and a locked door wouldn't stop the men who were coming. He put the children on his horse, the boy in front of him, the girl clinging to his back, and they rode west, away from the town, away from the road, into the rugged, broken country of the Badlands. The air grew colder as they climbed higher, the familiar landscape of the prairie giving way to stark rock formations and deep, shadowed canyons. This was ranger country, a place where a man could disappear, a place where a man could make a stand. After hours of riding, they came to a small, hidden cave, nestled behind a waterfall. It was a place Elias had used as a hideout years ago. It was damp and cold, but it was safe. He built a small, smokeless fire, and they huddled around its meager warmth. "Now," he said, holding up the locket, "let's see what's so important about this." He took out his knife and began to carefully work at the clasp. It was stubborn, sealed with dirt and time, but finally, with a soft click, it sprang open. It wasn't a picture inside. It wasn't a lock of hair. It was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper. And something else. A small, intricately shaped brass key. Elias carefully unfolded the paper. It was a map. A crudely drawn map of the town, with a single building circled in red ink. The bank. And next to the circle were 3 numbers. 1-42, a safety deposit box. The key was for the box. The map was how to find it. And whatever was in that box was the reason the children's mother was dead. It was the reason Sheriff Miller was hunting them. But there was something else on the paper. A few words scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. "Jedediah is alive. He has the ledger. God help us all." Jedediah McKinley, the leader of the gang, the man Elias thought he had killed in a shootout 10 years ago. He was alive, and he had a ledger, a book that likely contained every dirty secret, every crime, every name connected to his criminal enterprise. An enterprise that his brother, Sheriff Miller, had apparently continued in his absence. Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. He hadn't just stumbled into a local dispute. He had walked back into the middle of the war he thought he had finished a decade ago. And this time, the enemy wasn't just an outlaw. He was the law. He looked at the 2 small children, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and trust. They had no one else. Their mother had entrusted them not just with a key, but with the truth. A truth so dangerous it had gotten her killed. He knew what he had to do. Running was no longer an option. Hiding was a temporary solution at best. The only way to keep these children safe, the only way to truly end this, was to go back to that town, walk into that bank, and open box 142. He had to uncover the truth and expose Miller and his brother for what they were. It was a suicide mission. He would be walking into the lion's den. But as he looked at the girl's determined face, so much like her mother's must have been, he knew he didn't have a choice. He had spent 2 years running from his past. Now it was time to face it. "Get some sleep," he told the children, his voice softer than he felt. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." He sat by the fire long after they had fallen asleep, the small brass key cool in his palm. He was no longer Elias Turner, the quiet rancher. He was Elias Turner, Texas Ranger. And he had one last job to do. He left the children in the cave at dawn. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. He gave the girl his second pistol, a small but reliable Colt. He showed her how to use it. You don't fire unless someone is standing in the mouth of this cave, he instructed, his hands on her small shoulders. You hear me? Not before. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. The boy just cried, clinging to Elias's leg. I'll be back, Elias promised, prying the boy's fingers away. I'll be back before the sun sets. It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The ride back to town was a ride through a gallery of ghosts. Every rock, every canyon reminded him of the life he'd left behind. The men he'd hunted, the friends he'd lost. He wasn't just riding toward a confrontation with Sheriff Miller. He was riding toward a reckoning with himself. He didn't ride into town like a rancher. He rode in like a ranger. His hat was pulled low, his duster covering the Colt revolver strapped to his hip. He tied his horse not in front of the bank, but 2 doors down, in front of the saloon, where it would attract less attention. The town was quiet, the midday sun baking the dust in the street. He saw one of Miller's deputies watching him from the sheriff's office across the way. They knew he was here. Of course they did. They were probably watching the bank, waiting for him. This was the trick. He couldn't just walk in the front door. He went into the saloon. It was dark and smelled of stale beer. A few men were playing cards at a back table. Elias walked straight to the bar. Whiskey, he said to the bartender. The man slid him a glass. Elias took a sip, his eyes scanning the room in the mirror behind the bar. The deputy was still across the street. But there was another man, a hulking figure in a long black coat, standing in the shadows of the alleyway next to the bank, waiting. Elias had an idea. It was risky, but it was the only way. He finished his whiskey, slid a coin across the bar, and walked out the back door of the saloon. The back alley ran behind the entire street. He moved quickly, silently, his boots making no sound in the soft dirt. He crept along the back of the buildings until he reached the rear of the bank. The back door was thick oak with a heavy iron lock, but the window next to it was old, the frame warped. He pulled out his knife and went to work on the latch. It took him less than a minute. The window slid open with a soft groan. He slipped inside into a small, cluttered storage room. He could hear the low murmur of voices from the main lobby, the bank teller and a customer. He waited until he heard the customer leave, the bell over the front door jingling. Now, he moved out of the storage room, his gun drawn. The bank teller, a small, balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up and his eyes went wide with terror. Don't say a word, Elias whispered, his voice a low growl. I'm not here to rob you. I just need to get into one of your boxes. The man was trembling, but he nodded. Which one? He squeaked. 142, Elias said. The teller's face went white. I can't. Sheriff Miller's orders. No one is to access that box. The sheriff isn't here right now, Elias said, pressing the barrel of the Colt gently against the man's chest. I am. Take me to the vault. The teller, his face slick with sweat, led Elias to the back of the bank, to the massive black iron door of the vault. He spun the combination lock with shaking hands. The door swung open with a heavy, grinding sound. The vault was cold and silent. Rows of small, brass-plated boxes lined the walls. The teller pointed to a box in the middle row. 142. The key, Elias said, never taking his eyes off the man. The teller unlocked a drawer and handed him a second key, the bank's master key for the boxes. Elias stepped up to box 142. He inserted the bank's key, then the small, intricate brass key from the locket. He turned them both. There was a solid, satisfying click. He pulled the long, narrow metal box out. It was heavy. He carried it over to the small table in the center of the vault and lifted the lid. It was full of money. Stacks of bills, neatly wrapped. But that wasn't what he was looking for. Underneath the money, at the very bottom of the box, was a thick, leather-bound book. The ledger. He opened it. The pages were filled with neat, precise columns of names, dates, and numbers. It was a detailed record of every crime the McKinley gang had ever committed. Extortion, robbery, murder. It listed the names of ranchers they'd forced off their land, the banks they'd robbed, the lawmen they'd paid off. And at the bottom of every page was the signature of the man who had orchestrated it all, Jedediah McKinley. But there was another signature that appeared again and again next to payments received. Sheriff Miller. He hadn't just been helping his brother. He had been a full partner. This ledger would not only hang Jedediah, it would destroy Miller and expose the corruption that ran through the heart of this town. He heard the bell over the front door jingle. "Stay here," he hissed at the teller, "and stay quiet." He tucked the ledger inside his duster, leaving the money in the box, and crept to the edge of the vault door. He peered out. Sheriff Miller was standing in the lobby, talking to his deputy. The man in the black coat was with them. "He's in here somewhere," Miller was saying. "Check the back." Elias knew he was trapped. He couldn't go out the front. He couldn't go out the back. The man in the black coat started walking toward the vault. There was no way out, except one. He looked up. In the ceiling of the vault was a small, grated ventilation shaft. It was a long shot, a desperate chance, but it was the only one he had. He shoved the table against the wall, climbed on top of it, and pushed at the grate. It was heavy, but it moved. He pulled himself up into the tight, dark space, the ledger clutched tight to his chest. He heard the vault door creak open below him just as he managed to pull the grate back into place. He was in the crawl space between the ceiling and the roof. It was dark, hot, and filled with cobwebs. He could hear Miller and his men searching the vault below, their voices echoing in the small space. He had the ledger. He had the truth. But he was trapped, like a rat in a wall, and it was only a matter of time before they found him. The heat in the crawl space was suffocating. Dust and cobwebs filled his nose and mouth. Below, he could hear Sheriff Miller's angry, muffled shouts. "He's not here. Where did he go? Tear this place apart." Elias knew he had only minutes. He began to crawl, moving as quickly and quietly as he could, the precious ledger tucked securely inside his duster. The crawl space ran the length of the building. His only hope was that it connected to one of the adjacent buildings. He moved toward the saloon, praying for an opening. His fingers brushed against wood. A wall. The end of the line. He was trapped. But then he felt it. A small, square patch that felt different. Weaker. It was an old repair, a piece of plywood nailed over a hole. He pressed against it. It gave slightly. He pressed harder, using his shoulder, and with a soft crack, the wood splintered. He was through. He found himself in the dusty, cluttered attic of the saloon. He could hear the tinny sound of a piano and the murmur of conversation from the floor below. He had a new problem: how to get down without being seen. He crept to the edge of the attic floor and peered through a gap in the floorboards. He was directly above the back room, the one where the card game was happening. The room was thick with cigar smoke. 4 men were at the table, their attention focused on their cards. The back door, the same one he had used to get into the alley, was just a few feet away. He had no choice. It was now or never. He took a deep breath, swung his legs over the edge, and dropped. He landed on a stack of empty crates, the wood groaning and cracking under his weight, but miraculously not breaking. The card players jumped to their feet, their hands instinctively going for their guns. "Just passing through, boys," Elias said, not breaking stride. He pushed past them, threw open the back door, and stumbled out into the alleyway. He didn't wait to see their reaction. He ran. He raced down the alley, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear shouts behind him. "Hey, stop!" The alarm had been raised. He burst out of the alley and onto the main street, right in front of his horse. He untied the reins with fumbling fingers, swung himself into the saddle, and kicked the horse into a gallop. A gunshot rang out, the bullet whining past his ear. He didn't look back. He leaned low over the horse's neck and rode, the wind whipping at his face. He had done it. He had the ledger. He had the proof. But as he cleared the edge of town, he saw them. 2 riders, silhouetted against the setting sun, blocking the trail that led back to the Badlands. Back to the cave. Back to the children. It was the man in the black coat and one of Miller's deputies. They had anticipated his escape route. They had him cut off. He pulled his horse to a skidding halt. He was trapped between the town he had just escaped and the men who were waiting to kill him. He drew his Colt, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in his hand. He was outnumbered. He was outgunned. But he had something they wanted, and he had something to protect. "That's far enough, Turner," the deputy shouted. "The sheriff wants that book." "He can have it," Elias yelled back, playing for time, his mind racing, looking for any advantage, any way out. "But he's going to have to come and get it himself." He knew Miller wouldn't come. He would send his dogs to do his dirty work. As the two riders began to spread out, trying to flank him, Elias made a split-second decision. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to fight them here, out in the open. He was going to lead them on a chase through the country he knew better than they ever could. The country where he had once been the hunter. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it hard, not back toward the cave, but deeper into the rocky, treacherous terrain to the south. It was a dangerous gamble. It would take him further away from the children. But it was the only way to draw these men away from them. The chase was on. He could hear their hoofbeats behind him, steady and relentless. They were confident. They thought they had him. But they were in his territory now. And the sun was setting. In the dark, the hunter would become the hunted. The chase stretched for miles, a desperate race through a landscape of twisted rock and thorny brush. Elias pushed his horse to its limit, his only goal to put as much distance as possible between Miller's men and the cave where the children were hiding. He used every trick he knew, every shortcut through the treacherous canyons that only a ranger would know. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, he finally found the place he was looking for. A narrow pass, barely wide enough for a single horse, known as Widow's Gap. It was a natural bottleneck, a perfect place for an ambush. He dismounted, led his horse into a small alcove, and took up a position behind a cluster of boulders that overlooked the entrance to the pass. He pulled out his rifle, checked the load, and waited. The ledger was a heavy weight inside his duster, a constant reminder of what was at stake. He didn't have to wait long. He heard the sound of their horses, slowed to a walk now as they navigated the difficult terrain. The deputy came through the pass first, his gun drawn, his eyes scanning the shadows. The man in the black coat was right behind him. Elias let them get halfway through the pass. Then he fired. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed for the rock face just above the deputy's head. The shot echoed like a thunderclap in the narrow canyon. Rock chips and dust rained down on the deputy, causing his horse to rear up in panic. The man was thrown from his saddle, landing hard on the ground with a cry of pain. The man in the black coat reacted instantly, diving from his horse and taking cover behind a rock, firing his own pistol blindly in Elias's direction. The bullets ricocheted off the boulders around Elias, whining like angry hornets. "Give it up, Turner," the man yelled. "There's two of us." "Your friend doesn't look like he's in any shape to fight," Elias yelled back. The deputy was moaning on the ground, clutching his leg. It looked broken. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The two men exchanged sporadic gunfire, neither able to get a clear shot. The sky grew darker. The night grew colder. Elias knew he had the advantage. He had patience. He had the high ground. And he had a reason to win that was far more powerful than money or fear. Finally, he heard the man in black curse. "All right, Turner, you win this round." He heard the man drag the injured deputy back to his horse. "But this ain't over. Miller will find you. He'll hunt you to the ends of the earth for that ledger." Elias watched them ride away, the injured deputy slumped over his saddle. He waited until the sound of their hoofbeats had completely faded before he allowed himself to relax. He had won. He had survived. He made his way back to his horse, his body aching with exhaustion. He knew the man was right. Miller wouldn't give up. But Elias had bought himself some time, and now he had the evidence he needed to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. He rode through the night, the stars his only guide. He finally reached the cave just as the first hint of dawn was breaking in the east. He was so tired he was swaying in the saddle. He called out softly as he approached the waterfall. "It's me. It's Elias." The girl's small face peeked out from behind the curtain of water, the barrel of his Colt pistol held steady in her two small hands. When she saw it was him, she lowered the gun and ran out to meet him, her brother right behind her. He slid from the saddle and knelt, pulling them both into a hug. The relief was so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. They were safe, for now. "Did you get it?" the girl asked, her voice a hopeful whisper. Elias pulled the ledger from his duster. "I got it," he said, a weary smile touching his lips. "I got it all." He looked at the book, then at the two children who had risked everything to protect it. Now, he said, it's time to finish this. But we're not going to do it by running or hiding. We're going to do it with the truth. He knew what he had to do next. It was the biggest gamble of all. He couldn't go to the local law. The law was corrupt. He had to go over Miller's head. He had to get the ledger to someone who couldn't be bought. Someone who would see that justice was done. There was only one man he could trust. His old captain from the Rangers, a man named Marcus Thorne. But Thorne was retired, and he lived in Austin, over 200 miles away. It was a long, dangerous journey, a journey that Miller and his men would do anything to stop. But it was their only hope. They rested in the cave for a day, eating the last of their supplies. Elias slept in short, fitful bursts, the ledger never leaving his side. He explained the plan to the girl. She listened intently, her small face serious. "We'll do it," she said with a certainty that belied her years. "We'll get it there." They set out the next night, traveling only in the dark, resting during the day in hidden arroyos and dense thickets. It was slow, grueling work. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every sound made them jump. They were fugitives, hunted and alone. On the third night, their luck ran out. They were crossing a wide, open plain when they saw the riders. 3 of them, fanned out, moving fast. They had been spotted. "Hold on!" Elias yelled, kicking his horse into a desperate gallop. The children clung to him, their small bodies pressed tight against his. The riders gained on them, their shouts carrying on the night air. A gunshot cracked, the bullet kicking up dust just behind them. There was nowhere to hide, no cover. They were exposed. Elias drew his Colt, preparing to make a last stand. This was it. This was the end of the line. But then a new sound cut through the night, the thunder of more hoofbeats. Not from behind them, but from the side. A 4th rider, a 5th, a 6th. A whole posse, riding hard, their guns drawn. Elias's heart sank. Miller had sent everyone he had. It was over, but the riders weren't firing at him. They were firing at the 3 men who were chasing him. The posse swept past Elias, surrounding Miller's men, disarming them with brutal efficiency. As the dust settled, a single rider trotted toward Elias. He was an older man, with a grey mustache and eyes that had seen everything. He wore the familiar star of a Texas Ranger on his vest. "Elias Turner," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Been a long time. You're a hard man to find." Elias stared at him, stunned. It was Marcus Thorne, his old captain. "Captain, how did you find me?" Thorne smiled, a rare and welcome sight. "The world is smaller than you think, son. When Sheriff Miller put out a bounty on you and 2 children, a bounty for kidnapping, the news reached me. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound like the Elias Turner I knew, so I decided to come and see for myself." Elias was so overcome with relief he could barely speak. He swung down from his horse, the children sliding down after him. He walked over to Thorne and handed him the leather-bound book. "It's all in here, Captain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything." Thorne took the ledger and opened it. He scanned a few pages, his expression growing darker with every line he read. "McKinley," he said, the name a curse on his lips. "I thought that snake was dead." He looked up at Elias, then at the 2 small, frightened children. "You did good, Elias," he said. "You did real good." The fight was finally over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. With the ledger in hand, Captain Thorne and his rangers cleaned up the town. Sheriff Miller and his brother, Jedediah McKinley, who had been hiding in plain sight as a prosperous merchant, were arrested along with a dozen other men whose names were in the book. The corruption that had poisoned the town for a decade was cut out at its root. Justice, it turned out, had a long memory. Elias and the children stayed at the ranch. The cloud of fear that had hung over it for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of peace that Elias hadn't felt in years. The quiet was no longer lonely. It was filled with the sound of the boys' laughter and the girls' soft humming. A few weeks later, Captain Thorne paid them a visit. He brought news that the McKinley brothers had been tried and sentenced to hang. He also brought adoption papers. Elias sat on the porch steps that evening, the papers resting on his knee. The girl, whose name he now knew was Sarah, sat beside him. Her brother, Luke, was chasing fireflies in the yard. Mama said there were good men in the world, Sarah said quietly, her head resting on Elias's arm. I just never saw one before. Elias looked out at the horizon where the last light of the day was fading to purple. Your mama was right, he said. Sometimes they're just a little hard to find. He looked down at the papers. It wasn't a life he had ever imagined for himself. But as Luke ran over and threw his arms around his neck, and Sarah squeezed his hand, he knew it was the life he was meant to have. The ranch was no longer a place to hide from the past. It was a place to build a future. A home isn't about the wood and nails that hold it together. It's about the people inside. It's about a warm meal on a wooden table, a safe place to sleep, and the quiet promise that no matter what shadows gather on the road, you won't have to face them alone. It's built one small kindness, one brave choice at a time. What city are you watching our video from? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more just like it.